Welcome to Review Duty. Today we'll be taking a look at Infinity Ward's second entry, Call of Duty 2, released for PC in 2005 and the first in the mainline series to be made for console, releasing as an Xbox 360 launch title a month later. To attempt to put its release in better context, this would be a year after Halo 2, Half-Life 2, and Doom 3 all left their lasting marks on the industry. Like the first, this game is separated into 3 different campaigns, though this time the order therein is flipped, starting with the Russians. Thankfully, unlike the protracted, empty-feeling Russian campaign of the first game, this one's alright, and actually feels short compared to the other ones, almost like it's serving as the tutorial section for the rest of the game. Speaking of tutorials, this game starts with another boot camp section, but it has a lot more personality to it.
These are potatoes, Comrade Commissar! Why are we using potatoes instead of real grenades?
Because real grenades are valuable. In fact, they are worth a lot more than you are.
Oh, of course, Comrade Commissar, my mistake.
And it transitions seamlessly into the action, where you'll quickly notice that a lot has changed in the 2 years since the last game. We now have regenerating health, a 2-gun limit, and a grenade proximity indicator, which is very welcome due to the grenade-happy nature of the enemies. Still no sprint ability, however. I mentioned the very wimpy sprint Grey Matter Studios added to United Offensive at the end of the last video, but sadly it seems Infinity Ward did not care to add even that to their second entry. Oh, and manual saves are gone, replaced with the now standard checkpoint system. Thankfully, just as I've come to expect from this series, the system is well implemented and I never once felt like a checkpoint left me in an unwinnable situation, or set unfairly far back. As you might expect, the visuals have gotten an uplift as well, with many dynamic effects being used to liven up the scenes. I especially love the light shafts that appear as you're getting shot at inside this pipe. We've really come a long way since Half-Life 1. General atmosphere is also something I think this game does a really great job at. Being from Minnesota, I find a strange, comforting feeling in seeing games accurately emulate winter weather, and at many points during the Russian campaign, they really nail that depressing, overcast winter day, where despite it being the middle of the day, everything's dark and there's this bitter cold that just cuts straight through you. Really takes me back to walking home from school singing Boulevard of Broken Dreams to myself. Now, while a lot of the graphics are better, sadly it's not all positive. Later on, you're tasked with running up to tanks and planting sticky bombs on them, an honestly pretty thrilling event until they keep recycling the same thing throughout the game. Anyway, vehicle explosions are dramatically undramatic. I mean, compare this shot with one from the original game. Perhaps these explosions are more realistic, but might I bring your attention to the silly, exaggerated way enemies go flying when blown up? Yeah, if that flies, then I want my big Hollywood-esque explosions, please. Anyway, the Russian campaign isn't really much to talk about. It gives you a good idea of what to expect from the rest of the game, and definitely leaves a better impression than the original one, but giving you a play-by-play I feel would make this review really drag on. One thing I will say though is that this game is surprisingly non-linear. Occasionally you're given multiple objectives at the same time and are explicitly told that you can tackle them in any order you want, but even outside of those moments, the levels are often really open with a lot of different paths you can take. It's still a very linear game overall, but I found this kinda cool. So with that all out of the way, let's move on to... The British campaign takes place in Africa, a location I always forget was part of this conflict. You are ambushing the Nazi forces from behind their lines, and I did not realize this my first time through, leading to this embarrassing death. Anyway, no huge loss. I go back and... Oh my goodness. The Thompson sounds so good. Seriously, this is, I think, the first time I have ever heard the Thompson be worthy of its nickname of the Chicago typewriter. In fact, it sounds so amazing that unlike every other game I've played where I immediately swap it out due to its pathetic magazine size, I actually stuck with it as much as possible here, just for the sound. Also, I've got to say that I appreciate the AI in this game, as they don't seem to all magically notice the player over all the noise of warfare, allowing for some light stealth gameplay at times. A ways into the British campaign, we're greeted with the seemingly obligatory tank mission, the first level of which feels more like a development test level to me, as once you're past the intro section, it's just a flat plain where you drive around in circles, destroying enemy tanks one by one. I know I'm not a fan of tank levels to begin with, but I struggle to come up with any good reason for this level's existence. The second level is better, with actual thought put into the encounters, but even then, considering that the next on-foot level seems to take place immediately after the last one, this just feels really forced in. Anyway, going on to that next level, you're trying to hold a city you previously took, and it's pretty standard fare for the first while, but after taking an armored car, you're treated to a vehicle turret section, much in the vein of some of the best parts of the first game, and just like there, this has some of the most fun riding in the game.
Get this thing moving, McGregor! I'm trying, sir, but I'm shooting controls are all in German! What on earth are you trying to do, McGregor? It's not that hard! Just turn the wheel in the direction you want to go! Oh, thank you, sir! It's very helpful, it's very clear now!
Unfortunately, you're just awkwardly being driven around in circles down the very narrow roads of a small desert city. It's still fun, but nowhere near as exciting as the high-speed chases in the first game. I actually have a suspicion about this that I don't know how I'd ever verify, but it just subjectively feels like the levels in this game are a bit more compact. I wonder if perhaps this was necessitated either to accommodate limitations of the Xbox 360 at the time, or to allow them to crank the visual fidelity of the game while keeping performance reasonable. Whatever the reason, or if I'm just imagining it, it generally doesn't detract from the game too much. The British campaign is pretty good in general, though. Just like the first game, it's probably the best overall out of the three, but doesn't really have any super standout moments, I'd say. Aside from this cool section where you have to use friendly tanks as cover to advance on the enemy, which is appropriately nerve-wracking. Now, we aren't really done with the British campaign yet, as there's a random mission weirdly plopped in the middle of the American campaign, but we'll talk about that after we're done with the Americans' D-Day mission. Though not as cool as the introduction to the Russian campaign in the first game, the intro here is similarly intense. Grappling up the cliffside and storming across a scorched battlefield while your senses are being bombarded by constant mortar fire, the frantic shouts of your fellow soldiers, glowing doors in the shadows. It's all so cool and well done here. It truly feels like you are desperately fighting for your life without actually being so difficult that you just feel like quitting. Continuing through a destroyed rural town, you eventually destroy a bunch of Nazi artillery guns and then double back to where enemy reinforcements have arrived, making it so that you now have to fight through the level again, but in reverse, which I think is pretty neat. Retreat? We're advancing in another direction! The next level is in the same area as the last one, but some time has passed and you're continuing to hold this line, come hell, high water, or dipping frame rates. It can feel like it's dragging a bit at the beginning, especially with the reused level geometry, but by the time you're pushed back to the no man's land area, it ends up feeling really intense. I would have liked it if they had played tense music while you're holding out for reinforcements to enhance the experience, but it's still fun as is. Oh no, they're employing bulletproof gunners! Oh, false alarm, I guess. The level ends very triumphantly with nice music that tries to make up for the lack of music throughout the rest of the level, though I'm of course not a fan of the documentary audio that starts playing before the victory screen.
We stand on a lonely, windswept point on the northern shore of France. At dawn on the morning of the 6th of June, 1944.
Due to budget cuts, I'm afraid we can only afford one scoped rifle, and of course we'll be giving it to Private Main Character. Not much more of note until we're back with the Brits again for some reason. I do at least appreciate that we're equipped with the Sten gun this time, which seems more appropriate to me than the Thompson. I don't really know about the historical accuracy of which armies used which guns, but I feel like as depicted in games, the Thompson is typically used by the Americans more than the Brits. Anyway, later on you fail the mission by shooting a Nazi soldier who you had no way of knowing was surrendering.
Hold your fire, lads.
The devs obviously knew this was a problem due to the game having a checkpoint at that exact location, but I think this is actually a pretty cool moment, as now you have to set aside your differences to help a group of wounded Nazi soldiers. It's a shame this culminates in an underwhelming vehicle section, which just really begs comparison to the original game's exciting chase sequences, since this also takes place on the European countryside. The next level has fantastic atmosphere as you're going through a destroyed town during a thunderstorm, and what I found the most impressive, honestly, is that the heaviness of the rain seems to vary as time goes on, even completely receding by the end. Otherwise, though, it feels like it's just going through the motions, and in general I'd say the same of most of the game from this point forward. It's not completely without exciting moments, but with the exception of a few things like my AI teammates throwing themselves on my grenade, or the super obnoxious hints getting in the way of an otherwise really fun holdout section, there's not a whole lot for me to really talk about. The real problem is that even though these levels are fine, the game's pacing feels like it died a long time ago. So much so that by the time I reached the final level, I literally wrote down in my notes, "Good heavens, the game's still not done yet?" And I think that should well illustrate my feelings at this point. The final level isn't even terribly climactic. We switched back over to the Americans a while ago, and we start with the most pointless vehicle section in the entire game, as the enemies are way too far away to actually hit with the amazingly bouncy turret, and you're almost immediately told to get off it, so why was this even here? After that, the rest of the level is pretty standard, and that's it. You get an ending scene not unlike how many of the other levels ended, and then are greeted with another documentary cutscene to close things out. For as rough as the final hours of the first game's campaign were, at least it had the sense to end things on a high note. Honestly, I feel the game should have ended after the D-Day mission. That level felt like a natural climactic stopping point, but instead the game continues on for another 2 hours with levels that aren't bad per se, but just make the game feel like it's dragging on. Now, I specifically held off on mentioning this until the end here, but I think I may have finally figured out what it is I find so lacking in these older World War II shooters, and that's that there really is no narrative to speak of, no story tying everything together. It's just a bunch of largely disconnected missions that rely on being based on a historical conflict to give it any appearance of cohesion. There's not really any character progression to speak of, and outside of Captain Price, I couldn't tell you a single character's name. This all leads to a very dry, unremarkable experience that's difficult to get emotionally invested in. There are hints at there being a story with fun characters, particularly during the high-intensity sections I praised, but there's just not enough to give this game the pacing it so desperately needs. But how does it compare to the first game? In many ways, it was a real step up. The mechanics feel tighter, more refined, the general presentation is far beyond what we got before, and its low points were nowhere near as catastrophically bad as the originals. That being said, I'd say the highs weren't as high either. While I can distinctly recall the car chases and the excellent start of the Russian campaign from the first game, I struggled to think of many moments in this that felt nearly as impactful. It's a good game, far more consistently than the previous, but it feels like it's missing a bit of a spark the original had. All that being said, I think I would have to rate this above the first game, just because of that consistency making it a more overall enjoyable experience. It still has a ways to go before it becomes the Call of Duty I've come to love, but it's still a good game in its own right.